When going back and talking about retro gaming, especially gaming from the 90s, very few games actually have that embodiment of what it was to be in the 90s. But when I go back and try to think to myself as to what one game in particular really holds the spirit of the 90s, especially the early 90s, I would have to say it is none other than Zombies Ate My Neighbors. And on today's episode of Retro Rewind, we are going to go over some of the things that made Zombies Ate My Neighbors such an iconic game for the time, and a game that has aged like fine wine, where gamers young or old can fire this up and still, to this day, get enjoyment from.
They're coming to your neighborhood.
You're not the pizza guy.
Zombies Ate My Neighbors! Now playing on Sega Genesis and Super NES. A 55-level feeding frenzy of time-cut creature features. Fend off bee-moving maniacs with your weed whackers, exploding soda pop, and oozy squirt gun. Save the neighbors! Or they're dead meat. Zombies Ate My Neighbors! From Konami.
What is happening, everybody? And of course, let's talk about some Zombies Ate My Neighbors. What an amazing game. I know some people might think it's really not that iconic, but of course, we all have our opinions. And mine, it has to be, if it's not in my top 10, it's at least in my top 15 of my favorite games from the 90s. And especially from the 16-bit era, it's definitely top 10, no matter what. Because this game just had so much to it, so many different layers, and it's definitely a game that I think needs to get a little more attention and appreciation than maybe what it already does, because as we know, there has been some remasters, if you will, being released on the Switch. That aside, there are still elements I think we need to discuss to just further the love for the game Zombies Ate My Neighbors. Zombies Ate My Neighbors went on to be released in July of 1993, and the summer of 93, to me, from what I can remember as a kid, it was just a fantastic time to be alive. Between, you had different Power Rangers stuff coming out, you had different Ninja Turtle stuff coming out, and I believe the Jurassic Park toys were coming out. And of course, you had those lovely Super Soakers that every kid wanted to get their hands on and shoot their sibling in the face with. But Zombies Ate My Neighbors, I remember vividly seeing that commercial and just seeing how it was presented just immediately made me want to go and get the game. But I knew, sadly, just because of how things were as a child, I wasn't going to be able to get it. But lucky enough for me, there was a neighbor that lived next door to me that actually had the Genesis version of Zombies Ate My Neighbors, and that was how I was able to first play the game. So believe it or not, Zombies Ate My Neighbors was not the original title for the game. Thank God that that's what they ended up with, because the original title was actually Monsters, but then they decided to change it to Zombies Ate My Neighbors, and that was definitely a great pivot on LucasArts' side of things. And the game was also technically originally built for the SNES before it was ported to the Sega Genesis. Michael Ebert, who worked on Maniac Mansion and Monkey Island, was also one of the designers for Zombies Ate My Neighbors, which definitely goes into probably why it looked and felt as good as it did. Which makes sense, because he was a huge fan of Robotron and Smash TV, and you can see those elements of both of those games being implemented into the style of Zombies Ate My Neighbors. Which also feeds into my own personal love for the game, as I enjoy both Robotron and Smash TV. So speaking of the designs, let's take a side-by-side comparison on how the SNES looked versus how the Genesis looked. So the first thing you're going to notice immediately is that technically the graphics on the Genesis are much more detailed and crisp and have a little bit more texture to them, whereas the graphics on the SNES, as a buddy of mine, Coy, would say, like smeared or stretched. But the weird thing is, myself personally, I actually liked the SNES over the Genesis, and I don't know why. And then secondly, the music. This was the one thing that I always felt that Nintendo did better than Genesis when it came to the game music. It sounds a lot more smooth and fluid, and whereas the Genesis sounds a little more gritty and crunchy, and that's usually because with the Genesis it was targeting more the arcade audience and giving you those arcade vibes and feels. So technically they did execute that correctly, but again, just for myself, when it came to the overall experience with this game, I preferred the SNES sounds and music. Another key difference in the SNES and Genesis version is that not only does the SNES version have a flamethrower that the Genesis version does not, but you can also use a password that is BCDF, and that'll take you to the first bonus level automatically before you start level 1, which is Day of the Tentacle, and that'll actually allow you to get an edge going into the game because you're going to be able to get some bazooka bullets, some weed whacker ammo. So this actually, in a sense, allows you to double dip on the SNES because you're going to be starting off at Day of the Tentacle, getting that med pack, getting the bazooka and weed whacker ammo, and then also getting a 1-up. So then when you go back and start at level 1, you have the ammunition to blow the hedges to then go back to the bonus level of Day of the Tentacle and then repeat the process again. So you're actually starting the game with 2 1-ups plus all of the extra ammunition. So the SNES players technically had an edge over the Genesis players. The attention to detail with this game was just so well executed, and just starting with the monsters and how they incorporated them into the game. They didn't just throw them in there and just say, hey, there's a bunch of monsters you gotta kill. Those monsters all had weaknesses of some kind, but that was up to you as the player to figure all of that out as you were going along traversing the game. And then the music, my God, the music was so well done. I mean, in my opinion, it has to be one of the best 16-bit tracks created. Of course, I'm a fanboy of Streets of Rage 2, but this one is definitely gotta be top 10, if not top 5 all-time best 16-bit soundtracks. It just tied in so beautifully with how the level designs were, just how everything was presented. It just added that extra eerie feel to it. Although the game is presented in a cartoony, goofy kind of way, the music, the sounds, and the rate at which the monsters pop out of nowhere just add that real sense of horror to each level as you're playing along in the game. It keeps players on the edge of their seat as to trying to figure out what is going to be going on next. And for a game of its time, adding that survival horror aspect to it, where not only do you have to do item management throughout to beat the game, but it also requires you to traverse each level and, venture out to ensure that you search thoroughly for different items or keys that you might need to get to the next level. And of course, with all of the horror tropes that they included in not only the level design, but also with the character design, I'm not quite sure they could have even done it any better. It was just executed so well. And all those little attentions to detail to me just go into play as to why this game is just so good and just so important when you're talking about retro gaming. Now I know Zombies Ate My Neighbors does get a little bit of flack because it's a little too long. I understand that it being 55 total levels, there's actually 48 if you just take away the secret levels, but that aside, it wasn't necessarily their fault. Because of how the rental industry was back in the 90s, they were hard pressed to make the game a bit longer, so that way it would make patrons have to go back and rent it over and over again to try and beat the game. Now, little did they know, at least I can speak on my behalf, most kids that played this game that I knew growing up probably didn't even make it past level 20. So even adding those additional levels, it just did nothing in a sense, and those same kids would have been going back and re-renting it anyways to try to actually get through what was considered to be the real game. Now, even though it is on what I would consider to be the hard tier of games, I don't put it on the same level of difficulty as, say, Ghouls and Ghosts. because there's a little bit of predictability that you have with Zombies Ate My Neighbors, and once you understand how the items work and kind of how to manage your item list, it's way more manageable and way more easy to kind of push through. Even though the game is long, it's more manageable to push through than what I would consider Ghouls and Ghosts to be. So to wrap things up, I just wanted to echo what I've been saying, is that I think people need to appreciate what this game brought, especially from when it was released. And if for some reason you haven't played this game yet, or you're thinking about playing it for the first time, or even coming back to it because you thought it was way too hard, don't worry. That is exactly what I'm here for, because why? Well, I'll be dropping some tips videos and a brief walkthrough on what you need to do in order to efficiently beat the game. So that aside, thanks again everybody for watching. Let me know what you felt about this video in the comments below, and then I'll be seeing you in the next video.